friends, it's Carrie. Thanks for tuning in again. Today I'm going to do a weekly wrap up. I'm going to talk about 4 books that I read this week. The first book I'm going to talk about is called Something in the Water by Catherine Steadman. And full disclosure, I did not read this book this week. I actually read it last week, but because I did the Roswell book review last week, I didn't have time to include it in a video last weekend, so I wanted to include it on this week's video. This book was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, and I am usually a huge fan of anything that Reese Witherspoon chooses, but I'm going to be quite honest, this one isn't my favorite that she's chosen. It was a good book. It was entertaining. It is a psychological thriller. It was suspenseful. My only complaint is that it dragged on a bit. And I think some of that had to do with the fact that the beginning of this book was so good and had such a great hook that made the middle of it seem so slow. At the very beginning of this book, we meet our main character, Erin, and she is digging a grave for her husband. And so with a beginning that is so shocking and startling, it's kind of hard to keep that momentum going throughout the entire book. So I think that was kind of the problem for me. I will say that, from there we go to her wedding planning and her honeymoon. So it is a bit of a mystery trying to figure out where Erin and her husband went wrong. And so it was a good book. It was entertaining, but it wasn't the best that I've ever read from Reese's book club. There was a saving grace for me in this book. So without giving the entire book away, essentially what happens is on Erin's honeymoon, her and her husband find a bag that contains a large sum of money and diamonds. And because of this find, they are in a very dangerous situation. And along the way, they encounter some very dangerous situations. Some very dangerous people. And it just so happens that she, at the time, was filming a documentary about prisoners. And one of those prisoners is a man named Eddie Bishop. And Eddie Bishop, for me, was my favorite character. Eddie Bishop, he was kind of like an old school organized criminal, but he was very likable, and I kind of thought he was the saving grace for me in the last half of the book, and I'll just leave it at that. So it was a good book, but I listened to it as an audiobook, and I don't know if I would have finished it as a print book just because of the pacing. But again, solid book, not my favorite of Reese's book club picks. The second book that I read this week was called The White Rose by Kip Wilson, and this is a young adult historical fiction. And this one's kind of interesting because this one was written entirely through verse, and I was kind of hesitant about that because I wasn't sure if you could effectively tell the story that you were trying to tell with this book entirely through poetry. So White Rose was a resistance group in Nazi Germany that was started by Hans and Sophie Scholl. And these two were brother and sister, and they were university students in Germany. And they published 6 political leaflets that spoke out against Nazi oppression and the Nazi atrocities. And they, along with one of their friends, ended up being executed for their resistance activities. This was extremely well researched, and I was very surprised at how effective this format was as far as the storytelling goes. The author used personal letters. The author used courtroom transcripts to tell the story, and the author also incorporated German words throughout the book, and she did it in a way that added to the story. It didn't detract from it. So even if you don't speak German, it wasn't something that would confuse the reader. Even if you're talking about a middle school or a high school reader, it's not something that would take away in any way from what the book is trying to do. I think this would be a great way to teach about free speech. This would be a great way to teach about any World War II event. I mean, a lot of key events leading up to World War II, and just kind of tracking the evolution of, Nazi rule in Germany, kind of are seen through the eyes of these young people. And that's one point of view that we don't often get. I think we get it, in the Diary of Anne Frank, but, we don't often get it in history textbooks a lot of times. And I think that this book would be a great way to show that in school. I was really moved by this book. I actually looked up some information on the White Rose movement. I wasn't super familiar with it. And one thing that I saw on the back of Sophie Scholl's indictment, she actually wrote the German word Freiheit, which is the German word for freedom, on the back of her indictment, which was something that was included in the book. And it was just really moving to see that, and I really think this would be a great book to include in middle school or high school curriculum. It's pretty easy to read, pretty short, 1.5, 2 hours maybe to read it. And again, very well researched, very historically accurate, and I really enjoyed it. I'll probably post in the description box a link to an article that'll show some information about the White Rose movement for anybody who's interested. The third book I read this week was The Woman in the Window by A.J. Finn. This book has been out for a long time. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of it. It was made into a movie. I didn't know that. And I think it came out maybe when the coronavirus thing hit. So I don't know if many people saw it in the theater or not. But this is a psychological thriller. And the main character is a lady named Dr. Anna Fox. She is a child psychologist. And all we know is that something really traumatic happened to her that has triggered her to become an agoraphobic person, meaning she is extremely afraid of going outside. She's afraid of open spaces, and so she is pretty much trapped in her apartment. What does she do for fun? She drinks way too much wine to the point where it's pretty clear she has a problem with alcoholism. She watches old classic movies, and she pretty much spies on her neighbors, which I thought that was a pretty interesting connection, because one of my absolute favorite classic movies is the Jimmy Stewart, Alfred Hitchcock movie Rear Window, and in that movie, Jimmy Stewart is a photographer, and he ends up getting a broken leg, and he's pretty much, secluded in his apartment with this injury, and the only thing he can do for entertainment is watch out of his rear window his neighbors, and he thinks he sees one of his neighbors murder his wife. And that's essentially what happens to Dr. Fox. She thinks she sees one of her neighbors murder his wife. And what makes the plot of The Woman in the Window a little bit different is that because of Dr. Fox's mental state, what we're trying to figure out is, did she really see this or not? Because Dr. Fox, we know she drinks too much. We know she has agoraphobia. We know something really traumatic happened to her, and she is on a lot of medication. So is this something that actually happened or not? And so I will say, not going to give away the ending, but there are two major twists that happen in this book. This was a very solid psychological thriller. I really enjoyed the fact that there were some parallels with Rear Window. Obviously, Dr. Fox was not as squeaky clean as Jimmy Stewart, but she is a character that you do care about and you do feel sympathetic towards. And I don't know a lot about agoraphobia, but I do feel like the way that phobia was treated in the book was very realistic, and the way they treated the anxiety that the character felt, you do feel some anxiety. I mean, the book did make me feel anxious about this poor woman having to go outside. So it was definitely a suspenseful psychological thriller. Definitely worth a read, and I can definitely see why they made a movie out of it. So might have to check that one out. The fourth book I read this week was Sadie, which is by Courtney Summers, and this is a much discussed young adult mystery thriller kind of crime drama. And if you look on the front cover, this is actually recommended by the author of The Woman in the Window. It says flat out dazzling, A.J. Finn. One of the cool things about this book is actually the format of it. Part of this book is told as if it were a true crime podcast. This is The Girls, Season 1, Episode 4. I've just got into listening to some true crime podcasts within the last couple years, and one of the podcasts I listen to is Crime Junkie, and as I was reading this book, I could kind of hear the format of the true crime podcast going on, and I thought that was a really cool way to format the book. Essentially what we have here is a main character named Sadie who is 19 years old, and since she was 16, she pretty much raised her younger sister, Maddie. Her mother was a drug addict who abandoned them, and Maddie has always, kind of depended on her sister, Sadie, to take care of her and kind of seen her as a motherly figure. And unfortunately, one night, Maddie gets in a truck with a man, and she never comes home, and the next day she is found murdered. And so Sadie obviously feels responsible for this, and the next thing we know, Sadie turns up missing. Her car is found, and one of Sadie's neighbors, who's kind of like a surrogate grandmother, goes to this podcast and says, "Hey, I want you to find Sadie because I can't stomach another dead girl." And so we flip between chapters where the podcast is trying to find Sadie, and then the point of view of Sadie, who is trying to find out what happened to her sister Maddie. She essentially wants to find out who murdered her sister, and it's pretty clear that Sadie has some extreme guilt over not protecting her sister, and the book isn't really isn't really graphic about it, but it's pretty clear that there was some abuse in Sadie's past and also in Maddie's past. And Sadie also has some guilt over that as well, over not protecting Maddie from that abuse. And I will say that this book has some twists, it has some turns. It is definitely a mystery. It's definitely suspenseful. It's definitely heart-wrenching. You definitely feel for this character, Sadie. And not all of your questions will be answered. I will just say that right off the bat. Don't go into this thinking everything will be wrapped up, because just like a true crime story, you know, most crimes aren't all solved and wrapped up with a nice, neat bow. Unfortunately, you know, there are things that remain unanswered and things that remain unsolved, and this story is like that in the end. But I can definitely see why there was so much buzz about this particular book. Very good. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was a very easy read. So that's everything I read this week. Next week, I probably will do just one review on one book, because I just started a book that my friend Lisa loaned me. It's called American Elsewhere, and I'm a little over 100 pages into it, and I will say this book is awesome. It's kind of mystery, conspiracy, sci-fi, I don't know what. It's a lot of different stuff wrapped up in this book, and I'm loving it. So it's about 600 pages. So I have a feeling next week there won't be 4 books. There'll just be 1 book. But anyways, it's one really good book. So thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you next time. If you haven't done so already, please hit that subscribe button, and I hope you guys have a great weekend.